one of the first things I did when I became superintendent was we were able to sort of adjust the budget and hire more in-school school counselors. They used to be called guidance counselors, adjustment counselors, et cetera. And I know that those individuals worked incredibly hard and had an impact on the students that they were seeing. But overall, there wasn't a net improvement in the system. The system was still overwhelmed. It didn't matter how many additional people we were able to hire.
Welcome, everyone. When we talk about MTSS, most educators think about tier 1, 2, 3. Mainly through an academic or a behavior lens. But what if the current 3-tier model will never be enough for the mental health needs that are walking into our schools every day? Today, we are talking about student mental health, why the existing system is stretched to its limits, and what a 4th tier could look like in practice inside real school districts. I'm joined by the co-authors of a new book, The 4th Tier, Modernizing MTSS for Student Mental Health, Dr. Armand Pires and Dr. Ryan Sherman. Dr. Armand is the superintendent of Midway Public Schools in Massachusetts and has served as a teacher, principal, curriculum director, assistant superintendent, and has been in education for decades now. He's also recently recognized as the Massachusetts Superintendent of the Year for 2025. Dr. Ryan is a doctor of behavioral health, director of wellness for Massachusetts District, and has worked with Dr. Armand for over a decade. And with a background and is also the professor of social and emotional well-being at Bay Path University. Armand and Ryan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having us.
Great to be here.
I would love to dive right into it and would want to ask what caused and what's the why behind the book. There are already so many resources on MTSS, PBISS, SEL. Why did you think the whole problem is still unsolved, and what made you want to write this book?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I'll start from my sort of perspective as superintendent and someone that's been in my current district for 16 years. You know, the systems that we had, the tools we had available were just failing. I saw that as a middle school principal, and then when I moved to central office and finally as superintendent, the tools we had, the structures that were available of having traditional school counselors to sort of support students and make sure they get back to class as quickly as possible was a clearly overwhelmed and completely ineffective system as far as the treatment side of things. So we needed to find someone that could really help us navigate a new approach to all of this. And I was so pleased and excited when the school committee allowed us to hire Ryan Sherman into the role, who comes not from a traditional education background, but really a public health background, which really was the first identified need, is that we needed to change our thinking. We needed to change the framework around how we were supporting students in that way. And so for 10 years, we've been doing this work together with some successes and some failures. So for me, the why behind this book is to really give back to our profession, to really help other district and school leaders understand that there is another way to do things, that we have experienced firsthand and have done a lot of work to better understand, that is having a direct impact on supporting students in ways that the traditional model has been unsuccessful at. That's sort of my perspective. Ryan, I don't know if you want to share.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and so as Armand mentioned, I before coming to Medway, I was in outpatient mental health and understood that world. And when I came to education, Armand has a background in public health. So together, we really started to re-envision what supports for student mental health could look like in schools. And I think, as you mentioned, Manik, the traditional models, many of them, which are great, really focus on student behavior. And there's certainly space and need for that. But Armand and I really wanted to look deeper to how do we get to the underlying needs and support those needs so that students can not only flourish academically, but also get their mental health needs met in a way that the schools and the outpatient system working together really hasn't happened before. And we really saw that as the gap that we were trying to address and drove the generation of this book so that not only we could support our own students, but we could create a framework that could be used, by hopefully by many schools.
I absolutely hear you on both of those fronts. And when you look at it, right, like I think sometimes we do not uh, figure out the problem in itself. So and I would want you to break the problem down in unpacking the whole mental health crisis and the limits of the current system itself. Before we jump into what the new system looks like and how you've structured it, what is it that's happening right now, and how would you unpack all of it?
Right. I don't know if you want to start, and I'll jump in. I know, and again, I think part of the positive sort of partnership here is that we both have different perspectives. So why don't you jump in and talk a little bit about what the breakdown is in the framework?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a big question. I think so as you mentioned, really where we have to start is kind of the youth mental health crisis. So it's a crisis that certainly accelerated post-pandemic and during the pandemic, but was on a slow grow before that. And we've really seen rates of youth mental health decline over these last 15 years or so around depression, suicidality, certainly anxiety. And so we've seen these youth rates of mental health increasing in schools in different ways. And while at the same time, the outpatient pediatric mental health system hasn't really evolved to handle these needs. So Armand and I certainly noticed this gap between the needs of our students and access to care and the limitations that we had within school to provide that care. So this was really the need around access and support that we were looking to address. And by melding what schools can do and what the world can do into this framework, we really tried to address that problem around access and youth mental health needs.
And I think, I absolutely agree with that, of course. And what I would probably add to that is the increasing frustration of the work going on in schools. One of the first things I did when I became superintendent was we were able to sort of adjust the budget and hire more in-school school counselors. They used to be called guidance counselors, adjustment counselors, et cetera. And I know that those individuals worked incredibly hard and had an impact on the students that they were seeing. But overall, there wasn't a net improvement in the system. The system was still overwhelmed. It didn't matter how many additional people we were able to hire. What we were finding is that the students with the highest level of need, who we couldn't get into outside treatment quickly. So we might have a family's permission to help support them to find a clinician outside the school. And it might be, 6, 8, 12 weeks before they actually get there. And in that time, a student struggling with mental health issues may decline and actually become more intensely needy around those things. So what ended up happening, or what we witnessed, was sort of this bottleneck. Like, our counselors were spending all their time with the students at the highest level of risk, the highest level of concern, the highest level of need. And as a result, we weren't doing great work in the other tiers of MTSS, which is the foundational tiers. I know we're going to get into that. And so we really need to look at this differently so we could sort of tackle this problem in a way that was going to help us feel better about what was going on. So that all of that kind of is the breakdown of the system, which largely revolves around the fact that an adolescent entering mental health care had been for us an incredibly laborious and intensive process that took a significant amount of time and backlogged or bottlenecked the entire system.
I absolutely hear you on these two fronts and I would also add that when the first time MTSS was designed, it wasn't designed with social media in mind. It wasn't designed with COVID in mind. It wasn't designed to see how things have changed, and like technology changes quite a few things across, and we have more results and data to prove that. So, and you said it right, like we're going to go into the tiers of MTSS. So I would actually take this moment to ask this. How would you define for the listeners who might not absolutely be aware of? I think most would be, but still take a moment to define what tier 1, 2, 3 are. And then we can set up what fourth tier would look like, and how would you reimagine
Sure.
that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Maybe I'll do a little bit of a preamble, Ryan, and then Ryan can get into the details. Just for the benefit of the audience and what we all know, what we're all trained when we think about MTSS, whether we're thinking about that from the academic framework or the SEL framework, is we think about this three-tiered pyramid with the bottom tier, the bottom part being tier 1, and then the middle tier 2, the top being tier 3. And there is an ideal percent of students that are supported in each of those tiers. And what we've seen is that we've never been close to that, either on the academic side or the social emotional learning side. So the model itself is flawed out of the gate in some ways because you can't get to that ideal state. We were certainly experiencing that. Ryan, do you want to talk a little bit about the content of each of the tiers?
Yeah. So I think the important starting point for traditional MTSS, those three tiers, is everything, it's built to be contained in school, right? So that all these tiers happen in school. They don't interact with the community or outside supports. It's traditionally how it's set up. And as you mentioned, it was set up in a way that didn't take into effect COVID, certainly not how social media and screen use will affect student mental health. So that it's designed where 80% of students have their needs met through social emotional learning curriculum. For many schools, that happens in the classroom, especially at the elementary level, or in health education classrooms as the students get older. Tier 2 is then often a pullout situation where students have meet with a counselor, often in groups in Tier 2, although there can be some one-on-one counseling. Also, traditional methods in Tier 2 are like check-in, check-out. So a counselor might have brief interactions with a student at the beginning and end of the day to see how they're doing and if they're using their strategies. And then Tier 3 often is reserved for IEP services. For students that have documented emotional needs, they're met one-on-one, typically with a school counselor. Some districts define Tier 3 as any one-on-one counseling, so whether it's IEP services or not. But that's traditionally the end of the model. Beyond that, kind of the next step is, or traditionally in schools, is to refer a student to their pediatrician or a family to their pediatrician to talk about outside services. So, I'll leave it at that unless you had more to add there, Armand.
No, I think that's exactly right. But that system hits this sort of end point, and that's where the failure or the break in the system is that counselor working with the family in school to get them to go to the pediatrician and ask for a referral, or even sometimes support the family to find an outside clinician, is an incredibly complicated process. Once we enter the healthcare system, as a school district, it's really super complicated and takes a lot of time and energy and is inefficient and all the rest, and doesn't actually get us to the end point of ultimately, in a better way, meeting the needs of our students, which is kind of where Tier 4 comes in, which is what I think probably is the logical next question. And we really think about it in two ways. The first is that we have to, as school and district leaders, we have to come outside of our traditional view of what school counselors do, right? Those of us that have been around a while, like me, remember a time when we were told very explicitly that school counseling is about getting the kids to the point where they can get back to class so that they're not missing instruction. Now, this is obviously different for students that are in the traditional Tier 3 who have documented disabilities and need this level of support. But other students, it's really about just kind of patch them up and get them back to class. If they need more support than that, then you have to find outside services for them. What we really identified is that we needed to take, and this is the first sort of tenet of Tier 4, is that district and school leaders need to take responsibility for the treatment model of students. Now, that means a lot of different things, which Ryan will talk a little bit more about. But the starting point is for a school and school and district leaders to understand that they have to take on this responsibility, because that's the only way you can make changes to the system that are going to have a very different impact on students, a positive impact on students than we've seen before. So that's the first tenet. The second tenet is really where Ryan comes in and talks about the specific services that then a school coordinates organizes or provides to make sure that we're meeting the broadening and more intense needs of all students. So I don't know if you want to talk about those, which are really exciting.
Yeah, sure. So the components, there's kind of 5 main components to our Tier 4 program, or not program, but structure. And the first is probably the least exciting, but really foundational, and that's around screening. So I think certainly when I started in this field 10 years ago, there was kind of a don't ask, don't tell around student mental health, right? That there was no proactive trying to find student needs. We would really wait for those to bubble up in the forms of behavior and then try to address that behavior so it doesn't happen again. We believe, and I think certainly there's been a positive trend in this direction, that you're not going to find all students that way that have needs. Certainly there's a lot of internalizing behavior. And if we're going to proactively support student mental health needs, we first need to ask. So screening, whatever that looks like in your district, I think, ideally you're doing some social emotional behavior screening to see where students' needs are there that you can support as a school district, and then some pure mental health screening. So whether that's around depression, anxiety, both ideally, or more of a general screener in the younger ages to identify needs and then help address those needs is kind of foundational to any good school mental health program. And then the 4 components of services that we believe are ideal for Tier 4 are in-school mental health services, so bringing inpatient services into schools, care coordination, so helping families coordinate care around outpatient services, because that is a confusing and complicated system for families to navigate, or your school counselors if they're doing it all on their own. And the third component is telehealth. We believe this is certainly we talked about technology in kind of a negative lens and how it affects student mental health. We need to really leverage those services, and there's many great organizations that are doing this for schools to increase access for care through telehealth. And then finally, wraparound services. And this one's a little bit, I think, less familiar to schools, at least in the way we view it. So we believe that there are many great services in the community that provide wraparound care for students, that connect the family, the providers, and the schools. Unfortunately, access to those services are very limited. Even, we're based in Massachusetts, where we have pretty good access to services, and even districts in our area have a hard time accessing them. So bringing these services in-house, the ideal of this is to have a social worker who works with a therapeutic mentor, and that person would work in the community and at home with students, helping them generalize skills and work on mental health coping strategies. And then the third component of that wraparound program is a parent coach. So someone that can help families and parents navigate this space, not only to understand their students' needs and how to address those, but also for their own support and how to cope with this, because having that family unit behind a student is so important to their long-term success. So I'll stop there. There might be follow-up questions, but those are the 4 main components, or the 5 main components.
Yeah, I think all of those components look really interesting, and I'm going to throw a spanner at you. Because if someone who's a school district and who's looking at it, there are 2 components to it, and I think both of you are quite equipped to answer. One is the budget constraints. So if you have budgets which are being squeezed year on year, is how I see it, and that's how almost everyone in education would tell you about. How do you function through this? How do you hire the right people in the right places? Because I think Armand said it before, like we have put people at the problem, but we haven't solved it because we didn't really put a 4 tier to it. And so that's part 1. How do you work through different budget constraints? And if you have those constraints, and if you have to choose between these 5, what is that one which you would recommend districts should adapt today? Because if they have just this much money and this is what we need to do. So hey, telehealth is all you can afford for the next academic year. So adapt that, or screening, or what would that be from your lens, Ryan? So I would put it in two different buckets and ask you those
Yeah.
questions together.
I think you're right. Of course, right. The budgets of school districts are incredibly tight, and it's super complicated to go through the process annually of identifying how you're going to prioritize those things. And the reality is that what's happened over time is that there's been growth in student mental health concerns that are actually having a pretty dramatic impact on the school culture, on the function of classrooms, on the needs of all kids. So you got to get to the place where you think about how you're going to prioritize the funding to support improvements essentially in what's happening in the school, right? So if you think about a group of students who are have a high level of mental health needs, that they're engaged in outfacing behaviors or acting out behaviors, they're having an impact in your school. If you're able to minimize that, reduce that, eliminate that, then what's going to happen is you're going to see improved performance of not just that student, but of many students. So it is hard to sort of get to that place. You know, we're institutions of education. So when we're thinking about, connected supports around mental health, it's hard to think about how you would prioritize that over another classroom teacher to reduce the class size in a particular grade. But our experience has been that the impact of doing this work well has many, many positive impacts on the school culture. Ryan talked about, importantly, a wraparound service model and a wraparound service specialist. That individual is able to work with the children and their families who have the highest level of need, who are typically impacting a significant number of staff members because of the level of need. When that gets focused on that individual person, it frees up those other people to do the work that they need to do, importantly. When we think about the amount of energy that school counselors traditionally put forth trying to identify outside clinical services for students, what you realize pretty quickly is that that's incredibly inefficient and a lot of wasted energy, so they're not able to get at that next point. So, and then the other thing that I would say is we've also seen some financially beneficial outcomes related to this work. In other words, if you have a child who has significant mental health needs, who becomes diagnosed with, whatever, if they are continued to be left untreated and you can't access outside clinical services for them, they're likely going to get worse. And in some cases, those students would have to leave their traditional home school in order to go to a specialized school for students with those kinds of elevated mental health needs. We call those out-of-district placements. As a school district, we pay the tuition for those students to attend because we have an obligation, of course, to make sure we're meeting the needs of all students. If you're able to disrupt that trajectory by building a system of supports before students get to that really harmful outcome, right? I mean, they might be placed in a school that can best meet their needs, but they're out of their home community. They're no longer connecting with their peers and their friends and they're not engaged socially, which can have other disruptive impacts. If you're able to do that, you actually see some benefits with regard to the financial stability of the district over the long term. So that was sort of my perspective. I think the second part was, so what's the not, you didn't say easy, but what's the low cost kind of thing that a district can do? I think that was your question, right? And maybe Ryan can sort of tackle that one.
Yeah. So I think it's such a timely question because I think we're all with the state currently of funding. The funding we're used to getting for mental health are questionable at best at this point, whether it's state or federal funding. So I think every district's thinking about this. I think so we tackled this in a chapter of our book. We kind of give some examples. If you have a budget of $0, all the way up to, 100,000, how would you, what components of this could you build out? And I'll just start with the one that's everyone can relate to. If you have a budget of $0, I would say, look at your community resources. Do you have outpatient providers in or around your area? Most people do. And those outpatient providers, their offices are barren all day. There's no one coming to see them. They're not billing anything because all their clients are in school. And many of those students in school don't have access to them after school, whether it's because of transportation or conflicts with other extracurriculars. So I think for no money, if you have the space or even partial space that you can bring those clinicians into your schools during the school hours, this is the in-school outpatient component of the Tier 4 structure. This is a win-win, right? Students are getting access to care. You're giving them space. They're billing insurance still, just as they normally would. And you're doing this at $0 cost, right? So I would start there because that's probably the easiest entry point. And then I would look at care coordination probably as kind of the next level up. This is within school budgets, whatever your school budgets is, this is a really low cost option, certainly much less expensive than adding a school counselor or a school clinician. And what we've seen through this work is that if you can alleviate some of this care coordination, this is basically like the work that when I first started, not only in my district, but elsewhere, when I would go visit, many of the school counselors were just in their offices on the phone, contacting insurance companies, contacting providers, contacting families, all doing that work to get a student in to see an outpatient provider. There are many services now that will do this work at a very low rate per student. And this frees the school counselors up to be doing Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 work at a very low investment. So not only is it helping access to students and providing a great service to families, but it's also impacting the school by kind of having that trickle-down effect with the tiers. So I would say those are probably the easiest entry points at either no or very small dollars. And of course, as you go up to the other components, there needs to be a little more investment. But as Armand mentioned, there's a greater return on investment by saving students from going out of district.
And just to put a finer point on the care coordination piece, I think, Ryan, you looked at sort of the amount of savings as far as time of counselors, school counselors, and basically you're gaining, like, depending on the magnitude of how many counselors you have, you're gaining staff time back, which in effect is like you're multiplying the number of counselors you have, right? I mean, I think for us in our relatively small district, it was like a 0.5 FTE or an additional half-time person once you stripped away all the work that was going on relative to care coordination.
It's a great point. The amount of hidden cost that comes along with this that we do not associate to that. It's like the opportunity cost, because half a time of an extra person is a lot of time. Coming to a different question though, and this is something which got released by OpenAI, that almost 80% of the students right now are using ChatGPT as a therapist. 1 in 5 kids have a relationship with an AI bot. How do you see it playing out, specifically in the mental health space? Because I do not see personally as a great thing. And how are you seeing it in the district right now? Have you guys thought of it, added anything on the book, or are you guys voicing it out to the students as we speak?
Yeah, it's a good question. What I would share is, as a district leader, I've become more concerned and alarmed with some of the headlines that we've seen about how those relationships, the frequency of use for sure, but also some terrible edge cases maybe of chatbots sort of getting to a place with kids, with humans, right, that really leads them down a dark and terrible path. We've actually communicated that out to families very deliberately to make sure that they're aware of this concern and this danger. We've also done some work around helping families understand the impact of social media and what's an appropriate sort of starting point. I mean, it's hard to dispute what is clearly coming out of the research around the impact on our kids. I mean, I think that there's, my perspective is that this is such a still relatively new technology that we need to make sure that we put guardrails and parameters up to the best degree possible until we know more. Do I think that there's an opportunity and a tool here? Potentially, but it has to be connected to a human who's overseeing. So maybe as an add-on support, but not as a replacement for, which is in a lot of ways the way kids are using it. And I think that there's a deeper issue here, which is really the issue of connection. COVID really had a deep impact on kids. We still see them, we still have students in our school who are deeply impacted by COVID and will for a few more years. And when you think about what's happening with the youngest generation, high school kids and those just out of high school, they're having incredibly difficult times connecting with other people and sort of engaging in what has traditionally been part of the human experience, that sort of pro-social engagement with others. It's moved to this AI space. It's moved to this virtual space in so many ways. We have to figure out how to get back to live in-person sort of social engagement in a lot of ways. And that goes for adults too, but that's not who I work with as my responsibility. Ryan, I don't know if you had any other thoughts around that. Really good question.
Yeah, I think it's such a timely question and something we're all thinking about. And I don't think any of us have the answers, right? I think we're chatting a little bit before we got going, and that the challenge is the technology changes so quickly, and the youth are always a step ahead of us, right? So how do we keep up and keep them supported in the right way? I think Armand hit on it. I think as school leaders and people in the trying to think forward in the mental health space for students, we're viewing this now as a great opportunity for AI to assist, mental health counseling in school or outside of school, but not replace, right? So I think if I'll just give you an example, if you're a student and you're working on using coping mechanisms to help you stay in class, right? So you have anxiety, you're trying to stay in class, and I think there's opportunity if that AI assistant to the school counselor and transparent to the school counselor can help check in on you, see if you've used your coping mechanisms, remind you to stay on track or set goals, or be used as a way to reach out to your school counselor. There's some benefit there, and we should explore and see how that technology can be used to support it in that way. I think the worry is that it's used exclusively and in place of this human relationship or getting strategies from a qualified therapist. I think that's all of our worry, and especially some of our students that already feel isolated. Now that if the main interaction, especially around mental health, becomes a chatbot, I think there's real concern there that we're all worried about. Mm-hmm. So I think, with just like most technology, there's some real downside and some real upside. And I hope, that some of the great companies doing work in this space can help us use it in a positive way. But we're kind of on that unknown stage right now that we're all a little concerned about.
Yeah, I agree with you on all of that. And I think one of the components that you had said earlier, which is screening, would kind of help us here, because then we can make sure that the kids who are socially isolated could work together with a therapist in real life and not rely on a chatbot. So yeah. Now that we have this all in order, I would want to give this space to both of you to tell us, for anyone who's going to pick up this book, be it a superintendent, wellness director, principal, even a teacher, how do you wish they use it? Use it as a blueprint, study material, a workbook, and in what format?
Yeah, so I can start, Armand, and you can jump in. I think, Armand and I have, are certainly passionate about this space, and when we started thinking about writing this book, I think the one thing we really wanted to make sure was that it could be picked up and used practically. There are so many books out there that are wonderful and have compelling stories around social emotional health and mental health for students, but don't offer kind of take this back to your district so you can use it as structure to get started. So I think that was our main goal, and our hope is that there can be some perspective taking for sure by people that read the book, but then can take it back to their leadership teams, take it back to their school counseling suite, and use some of the strategies to support students.
Yeah, I would obviously agree with that. I would add probably a couple of things. The first is, for me, I think, as mentioned, if you've been in this profession for any length of time, you probably need to shift your thinking about the collective responsibility we have in schools to support students differently than we have. There's this interesting statistic that came out that a majority of superintendents really believe that student mental health is a priority need, but less than half feel like they're making any progress toward this. So part of this book is about sort of shifting that. The school educators and educational leaders love a framework, right, to sort of hang the work on. So taking MTSS, which is incredibly well known across the education space, and really thinking about that in this new lens of adding a fourth tier, then opens up the thinking about what is possible that may not have existed before, importantly. And then, as Ryan said, it is designed to be really practical, sort of boots on the ground. While, we talk like the easiest thing to do is X, we know in schools that even the easy things are really hard, really complicated. So you need to enter with a plan. You need to enter with a strategy and a timeline. You need to enter with a clear understanding of what you're trying to accomplish. And we're hoping that the book and the framework and the specific sort of initiatives that are laid out are done so in a way that's really approachable and allows people to take action, take them from where they are to whatever that next step looks like for them in an important way.
Absolutely. I think it's a great idea to make it more workable and functioning. And I absolutely applaud both of you guys to come together and take all your learnings and put it in a book. Before I let you leave, and this is going to be my last question for both of you, is going to be from a student perspective. And if you could give me an example of a student, names retracted, obviously, but like,
Of course.
just an idea of how the fourth tier has made a difference in their lives, and and how would you envision this to happen in all districts across the different states, and what would your vision look like on those two fronts?
Yeah. Do you want me to start on this one, Armand?
Sure. Yeah, please.
Yeah. So I can give you, as I'll give you an example that we try to outline in the book of in the traditional MTSS model, that the traditional 3 tiers. If we think about a student that, let's take an elementary student, right? So they come to school. The first 6 weeks of school is always great, right? And then we hit around Thanksgiving, and we know things start to fall apart. So if we think about an elementary student that has a great first 6 weeks, then starts to exhibit some behaviors. Those behaviors then are elevated by the teacher, maybe to a support team, so they take notice, and maybe they come in and do some observations, right? Then the student might be referred to a lunch bunch, that sort of thing. We're talking, by the time this happens, let's say, even if a school district doesn't efficiently, right? Then this is around December time, right? The student these behaviors are being addressed in a lunch bunch. They notice they're not getting really any better. So at this point in February, they're referred for special education eval. This eval, always takes some time, no matter how well staffed you are. Call it 12 weeks or so. That's going to push you out into May. And so by then the students kind of evaluated. They determine they have, severe anxiety, and a referral is made to an outpatient. And this is basically the end of the school year, right? So that's not a criticism. That's just kind of how the typical system works. So that student's basically lost a whole year where they've been disrupting a classroom, not because of ill intent, just because of their own needs, right? And we, as a district, we haven't got to the heart of the problem, and they've probably not learned as much as they could have that year, and really lost a year in mental health support. If you think of more about the tier tier 4 approach that we're recommending, that student is, screened in October for social emotional needs and mental health concerns. It's identified then that they might have an underlying anxiety needs. They're referred to their pediatrician for more evaluation. Then by November, it's determined that, yep, they're going to need some extra support here. As a school, you have some tier 4 supports in place. Maybe you get them connected with some in-school outpatient supports, and they're started to see outpatient care by December, and starting to see improvement soon after, which is what our data shows us, that there's pretty quick improvement. So then by before we even hit the winter break, they're in care, they've got access to care, they're getting the supports they need, and can go on and having better access to learning and certainly mental health support. So I give that as a general example, but that's happening in school districts across the country all the time, right? So I'm sure Armand has more to add, but that's kind of how I see the ideal, if you're implementing tier 4, kind of playing out.
And I would say from an outcome perspective, there are two things that I would highlight. We're typically not surprised in schools when a student at the high school shows up less and less frequently, and stops coming eventually. When that's connected to student mental health issues, what we've had some success is disrupting that, and that student is now connected and coming to school. We've seen some real impacts on student attendance rates, either staying the same or getting better, where we know that the trajectory would traditionally be, especially in that delayed model that Ryan's talking about, would traditionally be that they would come less frequently and maybe disappear altogether. I think importantly, what I don't want to lose is what then happens to all of the rest of the kids, right? So much energy and time and focus and personnel power has been put toward trying to support the students at the very top of this pyramid, the very highest level of need, that we have in some ways sacrificed the students who are starting to bubble up with low-level needs. And because we're not able to intervene, those needs grow. That's part of this bottleneck that I was talking about earlier. I think what we've been able to see is we've been able to see stronger tier 1 and tier 2 supports that has resulted in a smaller number of kids getting to the need for tier 3 and tier 4. At least that's the ideal over time. And those are very real things. I mean, I think as an educator for a long time, as a middle school principal, I knew where that 6th grade student would be by 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade if we didn't intervene. And I feel really proud of the ability to disrupt that trajectory that we've seen. And we wanted to share that experience, both our successes and some of the challenges that we've had over time, by taking the time to put this book together and hopefully providing a framework that's going to be really supportive to our field, to our profession.
Sounds lovely. Even on the practice side, it just looks amazing on how you've explained tier 4 and how it can be functioned. And I work more with high school kids, so I have a better understanding from that perspective. But I can absolutely see how it impacts the elementary as well as the middle school kids while they grow forward. So thank you so much for it. And thanks for writing this book out. I am super excited to read it. And I think a lot of our listeners would be too.
Thank you so much. We appreciate the opportunity to meet with you today and talk more about something that we're both deeply passionate about.
Thank you so much. You asked wonderful questions, and it was great to share some insights with you.
Thank you so much.